Welcome back, brave souls, to your Inner Child Matters, where we go into the depths of healing and personal development. Join us in this captivating video as we discuss the pathway to heal your wounded inner child with the legendary Dr. Gabor Mate. Prepare for an adventure on a transformative journey of self-discovery and healing as we explore the deep impacts of early emotional wounds.
What was triggered in me, however, was the wound of a one-year-old infant who was abandoned by his mother in an effort to save my life, actually. But the meaning I made of it is that I wasn't lovable, that I wasn't wanted. And even 71 years later, when this woman who I'm relying to be there for me doesn't show up, the woundedness of a one-year-old infant shows up. And that's what my friend Peter Levine calls the tyranny of the past. And so these early wounds, in my case, this sense of abandonment, could still show up 7 decades later over a relatively trivial incident. And these early wounds of ours, so that's one way that it showed up. It shows up in my relationship to my work. So I was a workaholic physician for many decades. Why was I a workaholic? Because the message I got as an infant under the Nazis was that the world didn't want me. Now, if the world doesn't want you, one way to cope with it is to make yourself very important, become a helper, become a physician, because now they're going to want you all the time. But that's very addictive, because you keep trying to prove to yourself something you don't believe in the first place, which is that you're wanted. And so that the more people rewarded me with either financially or with their attention or their gratitude for my medical work, the more I needed it, the more I became dependent on it. So it shows up in so many ways. These early wounds show up in so many ways. It shows up in our relationships, in our marriages, in our relationship to our children, in our relationship to our work. It shows up in politics.
At the time, you thought your mother abandoned you, but you, of course, now understand she was doing it to save you. Can you explain what happened?
Sure. So I was 11 months of age. My mother was a 24-year-old Jewish woman living under the Nazi occupation under a viciously anti-Semitic fascist regime in December of 1944. And she found refuge in a safe home run by the Swiss embassy, but there were 2,000 people living there in a home meant for 100 people. The sanitary conditions were terrible. Food was very uncertain. And I was very sick, and she didn't think I would live. So she went out into the street and gave me to a Christian woman, a complete stranger, and asked her to take me to some relatives who were living under relatively safer conditions. Her intention was simply to save my life, and she did. But as an 11-month-old, I could only interpret that as an abandonment, because I don't understand the conditions. Now, who gets abandoned? Somebody who's not wanted. So I developed this fixed belief, okay, I'm not lovable, I'm not wanted. Now, you don't need conditions of war and privation and such drama to give children the sense that they're not wanted. In this society, a lot of parents are advised not to pick up their kids when they're crying. That's enough to give the child the sense that they're not wanted and not accepted. And so I was traumatized so the trauma is not that my mother gave me to a stranger. The trauma is what I made it mean, the wound inside, that I'm not lovable, I'm not wanted.
Dr. Mate, let's go back precisely to how you understand and how we should understand the event of trauma. First of all, can trauma arise from a single episode, or is it something that has to, in some form, even if not precisely the same one, be repeated? And to what extent is the fact that you cannot know the trauma when it actually occurs account for the fact that its effects endure and as you say, show up decades later?
Well, as your question implies, trauma can be induced in people in a number of ways. It could be a single dramatic event, the death of a parent, a tremendous loss in life, a terrible explosion. You know, it occurs that way sometimes. And those are relatively easy to identify and then actually they're easier to deal with. But for a lot of people, it's much more insidious and much more chronic than that. For example, certain child rearing practices. For decades, the Dr. Spock, who was kind of the guru of parenting, advised parents not to give in to the infant's tyranny, the infant's resistance to sleep. Now, what he calls the infant's tyranny is the infant's desperate need to be picked up and held by the parent. That's just a trait that we share with all other mammals. You tell a mother baboon not to pick up their baby, or a mother cat not to respond to the child's distress. But here in North America, we've been telling parents for decades to ignore their children's cries. And or, for example, when a child is angry, a 2-year-old is angry, to give them a timeout, which is to say, to threaten them with the loss of the attachment relationship that they desperately need. Those events are just as traumatic over the long term, but they're harder to identify because they seem so normal and they don't seem dramatic. But they do show up later on in life in all kinds of dysfunctional patterns.
And Dr. Mate, you speak in the book about unresolved traumas. So in the examples that you're giving now, or indeed in the case of trauma more generally, if one can speak generally about trauma, what kinds of practices can lead, if at all, to the resolution of a trauma?
Well, whether we're speaking about on a social level, which we have to speak, or whether on the individual level, which is what it strikes most of us, the first thing that has to happen is a recognition that how we're living or some aspect of our lives is not working for us, and that there's a cause for it, which we can actually uncover by some compassionate inquiry. And very often, there needs to be a wake-up call. Now, COVID could have been a wake-up call for this culture, but I don't think it will have worked that way. It should have, but it didn't because of the nature of this society to transformation. The resistance to social transformation in this culture is so deep that the COVID lessons, I don't think have been learned, nor will be applied. On the individual level, very often it's an illness, whether of a depression, an anxiety, a psychiatric diagnosis, a relationship breakup, or a physical illness like an autoimmune disease or malignancy. That works as the wake-up call. So there's got to be some kind of event that happens that says to us, this is not working. We need to understand why not, and we need to move past it. And once we get that wake-up call in whatever form, and one of my intentions in this book is to help people not get to that dire, dramatic point where some significant illness has to wake them up. But once we get to the point of waking up, then we conduct an inquiry. Okay, what was driving my behaviors? Why was I always driving myself on a job like as if my life depended on it? Why was I a workaholic, stressing myself? Why was I so hard on my children? What is it that makes me feel so hurt when my partner doesn't pick me up at the airport, So then we start looking at what happened to our lives, and we find the answers in our history. And then it's a matter of letting go of those patterns, and that takes some kind of work, usually therapy, or some kind of spiritual work or psychological work, some kind of different way of taking care of ourselves. Usually it takes some inquiry, what I call a compassionate inquiry, of looking at ourselves with real curiosity. What is causing me to live the way I'm living, and why is it not working for me?
Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who could benefit from this great information. Don't forget to subscribe to Your Inner Child Matters for more inspiring information about nurturing your inner child and personal growth. Remember to value your inner child. Take care, and until the next time.